Let's turn our attention to, not a book in this case, but this time it's a 10-part podcast of someone trying to justify everything they've ever done. In this case, it's former ISIS bride, Shamima Begum. She always trying to be in the news over her desperate appeals to get her back into this country. She is in the news. She's landed a BBC podcast, a 10-parter, thank you very much, basically where she's able to justify what she had to do. She's retracing her journey from 15-year-old schoolgirl in East London to 23-year-old now being held in Syria on her road to join that brutal death cult. She says, "I'm just so much more than ISIS." But critics have accused the BBC of wasting licence fee payers' money, and said the families of ISIS victims would be mortified. Well, let's talk to Rebecca Ryan. She's campaign director at Defund the BBC and joins us now. Good morning to you, Rebecca.
Good morning, Julia.
Thank you so much for joining us. Look, I want to hear people's accounts it's interesting to hear people's first-person accounts, including Prince Harry's. Shamima Begum, some argue, is a horrific ISIS terrorist who was part of that regime, and other people argue that she was a victim at 15 of grooming by an evil organisation that persuaded her to go and join their sort of evil death cult, and that if is any other circumstance, we would be treating her as a victim and not as a perpetrator. Was the BBC right to let her at least tell her side of the story?
Absolutely not in a 10-part podcast. I mean, we've been inundated with people who are outraged, desperate to find out how they can stop paying this organisation. The BBC's completely lost the plot over this. Whilst it may be interesting to have some high-quality journalism looking at the role that she played, because intelligence actually shows that she was involved in sewing people into suicide vests, being part of the sort of religious police that was sort of making sure that people towed the line. She was an active part in the ISIS.
And there are a number of witnesses to this, aren't there? And it was interesting when she was first sort of found in this Syrian prisoner camp that she had no shame, no regrets, was absolutely, sadly, her babies were innocent. They're not their fault. She'd lost two baby boys already. Her third baby boy, he then died in the camp. But again, awful for him. But let's face it, she had chosen to go and move in with a medieval death cult in Syria without their health care. I mean, most mums wouldn't plan to do that, by the way, to make sure our children had a better chance of safety. But it is fascinating how many people sort of on the left are being very sympathetic to her. They seem to be so much less sympathetic, so at the BBC, to, for instance, the victims of the grooming gangs here in the UK, which I just find extraordinary. There seem to be some victims they're concerned about, very, very rich victims, Me Too, the victims of Andrew Tate, but very less concerned about other victims. You have to be the right kind of victim for the BBC to care about you.
Exactly, and it's just a complete hypocrisy, because what this is just misogyny. They're sort of saying, she just naively bumbled along over there with a sort of group of friends and somehow managed to find herself sort of attached to some nasty man, and she's just along for the ride. But it's just misogyny. She was an active participant in ISIS, which was essentially waging a war against the West, waging a war against our country. We saw the ideology kill hundreds of British people. I don't understand how we have a sort of, as you say, sympathy for her, but not sympathy for the victims of grooming gangs. It's just a complete hypocrisy.
Do you think this is a classic example of the BBC in trying to do what they consider public service broadcasting, just really being unbelievably out of touch with the public? Now, I'm not saying that people should do things, and again, I often think that I'll talk about things that, say, my own audience will be quite cross about and disagree with me, or we've been talking about vaccines and the like with COVID, and people can disagree, and people shouldn't be afraid of that, and there are still stories worth telling. I've interviewed people who've been, domestic abusers and perpetrators of sex crimes against children to try and find out, what was your motivation? What happened to you? Why do you? And not to excuse people, but to try. I think we need to understand. Is there a role that actually the BBC should have done this? You could argue that we may not like it. They may have had the wrong motives, but actually it could be useful to know this version of events.
I think the issue is that people just don't trust the BBC to present this in a balanced way and to really get to the bottom of this. And this is a topic that the BBC particularly, been involved in sort of really quashing any kind of investigation into. We look at the Manchester bombing. We look at all of these atrocities that have been carried out in the name of fundamentalist Islam. And the BBC is straight away trying to quash that down and is far more concerned about what they see as sort of a bunch of, ridiculous sort of far-right people living in their mum's basement as a threat, rather than an actual threat, which is harming people.
Yeah.
And let's see how British people feel. It's an injustice that we're not able to openly discuss these and say, look, these are atrocities that are being done against us. We can't look at it because we're being patronised by this organisation that we have to pay for.
Yeah, so much more coverage of vigils and people paying tribute and candles as opposed to discussions about the real issues. Rebecca Ryan, really interesting to talk to you. Thank you so much for joining us, Campaign Director at Defund the BBC.